Okay, thank you everybody for being here. We have a fantastic panel today. I'm going to do a quick round of introduction, keeping in mind that the subject today is about AI and digital technology, but very much focusing around inclusion. How can the next gen tech work for everyone? So starting from the top hand, we have David Kenny, who's the Senior Vice President of IBM Watson and IBM Cloud Platform. Then we go to Dan. So, sorry. Daniel Goldin is former administrator of NASA, longest serving administrator of NASA, and today is leading a company called KnuEdge, which we're going to discuss a little bit about. Aboyeji is based in Nigeria, is an entrepreneur there, is very much focusing on new technologies and how this can transform Africa. And we're going to touch upon this. And finally, Coursey is based in Palo Alto, heading TomorrowVentures, hybrid investment firm, focusing on anything from AI, blockchain, opportunity.
A diverse portfolio.
All of the above. So I'm going to start the first question with David, and asking you about the era of learning which we're entering today, and AI, and how can organizations and individuals leverage these for the greater good?
Yeah, so first of all, let me talk about the era, because tech has gone through kind of 2 or 3 major eras that last for a good 2 decades or so. So we first started with something called Moore's Law. It was just the amount of computing power could double every year on a chip. That created faster computers, smaller computers. So we went from mainframes all the way to PCs and then to smartphones, and that empowered everyone. We then kind of shifted to the power being in networks the last 20 years. So it's largely been cloud computing, internet, social networks, commerce networks. Now that we've put those 2 technologies to work so that they can learn information, so that they're constantly improving their knowledge, we're starting to see a third wave of exponential growth, and that is exponential growth in learning. And so I would say every year we're doubling the precision of a decision that can be made using machine learning on all forms of data, structured and unstructured. And that's going to scale up. What most people miss is that AI isn't something you just do and then it's finished. Every year you've doubled the intelligence out of those systems. So we're starting at very basic levels. We're kind of where the internet was in 1993. And it's going to go at exponential rates. So I think people being prepared for machine learning to double its value every year is going to be important. In terms of individuals, I think what's important as we do this is we do this in a way that knowledge stays with the teachers, stays with the companies, stays with the individuals that have the data. So if the structures follow the network structure, you'd end up with all the AI being in 2 or 3 platforms. If you end up with multiple AI systems, and we have to really structure it so it happens that way, down the road we'll have more competition, down the road we'll have a better economy. So I think a lot of what I'm focused on is making sure machine learning is divided up, and that we've got a lot of countries and individuals and governments and companies all building machine learning models.
So at the AI Initiative, we've been working with your team on using AI to tackle the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes.
And you're also part of something called Partnership on AI.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about this, how you can also use AI, other AI platforms?
Well, listen, I think it's a very powerful technology. So those of us who look at the doubling every year, you get out 4 or 5 years and you've got an incredibly powerful technology. It is important that be in good hands. It is important that be done for the benefit of humanity. The partnership on AI is IBM and also Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and a few others who are leading in the space. And we put our scientists together to make sure we put some boundaries in place that would work worldwide, to make sure that all of this science was for the good of humanity. And that, that's easier said than done, but I think it's having some important principles as to where the research is going. Part of benefiting humanity would be supporting the SDGs. So I think when we look at these big problems around health, around poverty, around climate and the environment, we want to make sure all this machine learning is actually put to use to find truly sustainable, economically based solutions to those problems. And I do believe in it. I do believe that we're not far from being able to actually hit those goals because we're in this new era of exponential growth and learning.
Great. Dan, can I ask you a similar question about the use of technologies for the greater good? So you mentioned a couple of points that you wanted to address. One of it is farming, and how can the use of technology enhance farming yields and also help regions such as the Middle East, North Africa region where we are.
Let me start by saying Voltaire said, "Work frees man from boredom, evil, and need." When we think about work, we think about being able to earn a living. But in the world that we live in, if people are bored and they have time for evil, very bad things happen for humanity. So as we look at the potential impact for AI, we have to make sure that it's not being used for just large corporations. It must be made available. It must be fast, highly economical, and above all, easy to use, so there's zero threshold for humanity. And in the limit, this is the vehicle that it should be used on. And ultimately, it needs to be used with voice, because there are many that are not technologically literate. So let me talk a little bit about farming. If you take a look at what's going to happen over just the next 12 years, humanity on this planet needs something on the order of 30 to 50% more food. Let's take Abu Dhabi. 80% of the food in Abu Dhabi is imported. It is not good. Now, there's new technologies coming along, vertical farming. In fact, last night I had dinner with the Matt, who's the founder of Plenty. But in order to make vertical farming work, there's going to be a plethora of sensors and actuators and measurements, and all of a sudden there's going to be need for humanity to get involved. And if we think about what has happened, AI is nothing more than picks and axes in a gold rush. Now, those of us on the stage, for the most part, are selling picks and axes. It used to be manual tools, then it became machines, then it became the internet, robots, and now we're at AI. So the key to it is, how can we use AI and harness humanity in things like farming? There will be spectral measurements, there will be measurements of air quality, there will be a variety of things that's going to affect individual farmers. And in this region, the best place to do it is in contained areas, because you could use 1 to 10% of the water. You don't have water here. So there will be all sorts of jobs that will come along with it. But in the end, humanity has to be able to do it on a cell phone, which they could even go in on. For a $10 phone, people could use it. Critical, absolutely critical.
So you're saying access to this technology will be easy because the price.
Ease of use has to be literally in minutes to seconds.
Right.
And it cannot have a threshold with high technical input. So for me, the criteria of use is ease of use is more important than almost anything else, so humanity could use it just like they could use a pick and shovel.
All right, thanks. Yin, you super a bit about Africa's future on technology. Can you explain why, and can you give us example of where it could impact and change Africa?
Yeah, sure. I think, first of all, it comes from personal experience. I spent the last 7 years in Africa working on high-growth technology businesses on the continent, and I've definitely, taken and worked with teams of young Africans to take companies from zero to hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of millions of dollars in revenue much faster than any company I saw in the Valley or in Canada, where I went to school. And that happens, and it's real revenue, it's real money you can touch It's not a valuation, it's not hype. And that happens because you're solving real problems on the continent. And many times when you follow the tracks on the train, and you have to think about the continent specifically from 3 vantage points. The first is you have the rise of a young and very talented population. The numbers that have been shared repeatedly throughout the conference do speak to that. And what you see in those numbers is really the fact that you're about to have a generation of tech-savvy, tech-only people who, quite frankly, will use services that serve them, right? So if you're talking about what the Snapchat of Africa looks like, that's a company I'll bet on because it will definitely make more money than the Snapchat that's public right now. And that's what you see first. And the second thing you see is you see mobile phones, right? A sea of mobile phones, over 900 million across the continent. And that's also another huge factor because nowhere else in the world has that level of penetration. And given it's a very young population, you even have it much deeply ingrained because there isn't any physical infrastructure to compete with it. There's no fixed lines anywhere. There's no call phones anywhere. It's just purely and completely mobile. And the last thing is really you have these huge problems, right? These giant opportunities where even governments can never, at any scale, be able to address. A practical example, you have in Nigeria 10 million kids out of school. There is no government in the world, no matter how efficient or resourced, that can build enough schoolhouses for 10 million kids. So the only way they're going to be educated is through digital, literally. And so when you put the combination of these together and you start to think about not even just what solutions apply, but what solutions must apply to solve the problem and the kind of companies that will be required to build those solutions, then you start to see the dollar signs and you start to understand why the technology potential of Africa makes so much sense. And the leapfrog is not just a PR gimmick, but it's a real thing. And speaking to my experience, in 2014, myself and a few of my friends out of New York and who graduated me from University of Waterloo, we went back to Nigeria and started a company called Andela. And the idea was basically, how do you build the next generation of Africa's technology leaders? And we started with a group of 4 out of a very small boys' quarters in the middle of Lagos. And today, we have 800 engineers in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, very soon going to Egypt and Rwanda. And the company is worth hundreds of millions of dollars, makes millions of dollars in revenue, has been backed by Mark Zuckerberg and Google Ventures, among many others, in just a space of 4 years, right? And then, because people said we were lucky, we went again and did it with Flutterwave, where we said, we see a huge opportunity with connecting Africans to the digital economy. There are so many of these young people who want to be able to do digital commerce, but PayPal will never touch them, or who want to be able to do business with their neighbors just across the border from them in Benin Republic, but the banks in Nigeria don't talk to the banks in Benin Republic, so they can't do business. And we decided that we're going to build a technology platform that would make payments, electronic payments, easier for them. And in just 2 years, we've already done $4 million in revenue. We've grown and been backed by MasterCard, Greycroft, Glean Capital, Greenvisor, and a lot of other folks. So it just goes to show you that some of the largest technology companies, it reminds me of China, right? Back in 2001, some of the largest stories, technology growth stories of the next 5 years will definitely come from Africa. The pace will be much more rapid than it was in China, and the wins will be much bigger. So that's why I'm very excited.
Great. Kurt, so you come in from the venture capitalist angle, which is essential also access to funds to develop these technologies. One of the sectors that you're interested about is healthcare and how AI can be used to detect and prevent diseases. Can you touch upon this a bit?
Absolutely. So healthcare is one of the things that I'm most passionate about because I think it has the ability to truly change people's lives. And I think it's the area that you'll see most tangible results from the population as a whole. So one of the areas that I'm particularly passionate about is, obviously not everyone has access to physicians and providers. And so, I believe blood testing can be a great indicator, for instance, in terms of detecting, chronic disease. I think that, great examples of being able to take existing data sets from, pathology that already exists around people that have had diseases diagnosed and being able to detect based on that. I think that is very powerful. You already see examples of radiologists, for instance, analyzing x-rays and being able to detect certain issues much more effectively than even radiologists themselves, which obviously speeds time and frees them up for being able to serve other patients. So those are things that I think are very interesting and I think become a very tangible way for people to see AI in use. I totally agree with Dan that I think the mobile device is going to be so powerful because it's really the first time that the population as a whole has access to this data on a global basis, and I think that I begin to think that changes lives and becomes very inclusive. And so for me, I think those are businesses that not only can be highly profitable, but also have the double bottom line of really doing good for people. So those are the areas that I'm really
Could I
interested in.
jump in here for a minute? Because I think Court is on a really good track. When you take a look at the part of the world that's developing, they don't have the healthcare infrastructure. So simple things like vector-borne diseases, you could track it right across a continent. And again, it comes back to having access to phones. And it's as simple as that. So I want to come back. When AI develops over the next 5 years, ease of use, very inexpensive, and fast is crucial. But we could begin to cure some of these diseases that go right across a continent. And with these phones, 900 million phones, Africa could be in a much healthier condition.
Absolutely. I mean, even today, this is not a very distant future we're talking about. We've done I've seen a number of entrepreneurs who've definitely taken the approach, for example, for things like blind river disease, of literally just leveraging your actual phone camera, which is a really powerful tool, and which you can get for less than $80, and using those basically as a testing device. And they take a picture, they send it millions of miles away, and it's analyzed and sent back, and the results are in. A little bit of human, a little bit of computer, and everything's working. And I've seen the same apply to blood samples. So you take it, you put it on the pallet, you actually take the blood sample, it's sent millions of miles away, the results come back in less than 2 hours. And this is from a remote village somewhere, in the middle of Lagos Island, right? So this is already happening today.
And everything from as simple as blood testing to, detecting moles, for skin cancer. Those are the things
lesions,
that,
this is already happening today. A little bit of human, a little bit of computer. When AI fully develops, we can continue to bring down the cost of the human element of doing this at the scale that is required. And your hospital in 2100 is basically a small clinic, a booth, pretty much, with a camera.
With a giant cloud computer feeding it with billions of feeds from the IoT.
Yeah.
well, and I think to David's point, this is like Internet 93 when it comes to AI, and I think that's just
again
amazing.
simple with a phone. You could begin. There are some. My company has been involved in this by using voice and the ability to detect small, minute patterns in the voice. You could begin to have a chance to detect the onset of depression. You could detect the onset of Parkinson's disease. So when you could get at diseases in the early stages, the cure doesn't cost as much, and you could have a whole set of new jobs available for people based on phones. In fact, in India, we've been working in India for a while, people go in on a phone, and all of a sudden that phone becomes a source of income, that phone becomes a source of good health, which is essential to be able to have work that's meaningful.
Well, and you're so right, Dan. It's like voice is so powerful that people don't know. We actually have a company called ShareCare based in the US that was founded by the gentleman who founded WebMD, Dr. Oz, Oprah, Sony, and Discovery. And we acquired a company out of Germany a little over a year ago that's able to detect levels of stress in your voice. And so when you're on the phone, it actually provides, when you end a call, it rates your call on a scale from green to red and provides interactive coaching back to you, trying to live in the green. And it's amazing how accurate that is from, it blew me away. The first time I used it, I was talking to the CEO of one of our companies, and I was asking questions about a term sheet they had gotten. So it was a very one-sided conversation. How much money? When is it going to close? What is the valuation? And I scored in the green, but it came back and said you might want to watch it. Your conversation was very one-sided and seemed very self-centered. So it's amazing that from a technology perspective, even the nuances.
How about for a farmer, you could use the sound, they're doing experiments with AI with chickens now. Think of a small farmer that has chickens, and if the stresses get too high in the chickens, you could pick up the subtleties in the chicken's voice from a phone, and you could have a much healthier set of chickens.
So can we stay on human health, because Watson is doing an amazing job in oncology and other sectors. Can you touch upon
Well, I
this
think
a
that
bit?
the technology is clearly advancing. And I would say the phone is a step along the way, but with sensors, you're going to go much further. I think we're going to be able to have wearable health. I think we're going to be able to touch things. We need to make it totally free and accessible and get the networks cheaper. But the other thing in this whole conversation is we shouldn't forget the doctors. Too often, AI has been viewed a little bit as the domain of the technical. But in the case of oncology, having Memorial Sloan Kettering and Mayo and Cleveland Clinic train the models got to much better answers than we first started with. And it certainly helped those hospitals, but then when those systems were deployed in other parts of the world, in Southeast Asia, it lifted the standard of care for everyone. So it exports knowledge. But I think it's not only important that everybody have access, but it's also important that the best knowledge train the models for all. So I think making sure that our leading oncologists, our leading radiologists are involved in this and that the AI models are actually trained by expertise is really important. Otherwise, we've got a great technology, but we haven't really lifted the standards.
But once it's trained, can someone in Africa or in India with its own phone be able to self-diagnose?
Yes, of course they can. I mean, to a limit, right? I don't think to a limit. I don't want to. I don't want to take away the role of a doctor. I think that they can do a lot of initial diagnosis. It's gonna save a lot of time. Yeah. Certainly today in things like melanomas, having people use AI to read their moles has made a huge difference in people not going to the doctor when they didn't need to, so the doctors could spend time. But if you didn't train the model right in the first place, you're not going to get there. Right. So I think this cooperation between between the developed nations and the developing nations, this cooperation between trained professionals, the technical community, and the population is key. Otherwise, I think we're just throwing technology out there without the training we need.
I want to make a point. I think even more importantly is also soliciting feedback and ensuring that the people who will be the majority of the people in the world have a role in contributing to the way this technology works. Because I'll give you a practical example. There's a very popular Facebook video that went around the other day. And basically somebody had built like one of these automated hand dryers. But if you were black and you put in your hand there, it wouldn't work, right? But if you were white and you put in your hand there, it would work. Now, clearly, the honest truth is that's still the way most of our medical devices work, right? They're not actually built for people in developing countries because people who built them built what worked for them, not what worked for the rest of the world. I doubt that you would have very well-trained melanoma samples, for example, that work for black people. I doubt that. I know for sure when it comes to blood marrow, even registries barely developed with Black people. So, I mean, at the end of the day, he's absolutely right. But even more importantly, the way we build these technologies has to be inclusive, and it means that we have to dedicate the resources and the time to deliberately go to Africa and many of these other countries and say, hey, the few people who are interested in this area, what are they doing, and how can we support them? Because they're a critical factor. If we're building technology that doesn't work for most of the world, it will be a waste, right?
Well,
Well,
this is going to change tech, because in that last era, a couple of companies in Silicon Valley and Seattle had the networks, and that's where everything was done. The reason we're putting labs around the world, and the reason I talk about having diversity is exactly this point. You need training to happen from around the world. You need to be more local in the training models. Otherwise, we're going to end up serving a handful of engineers that live in Silicon Valley.
Well, and not everything is consumer forward facing, because I agree with you, David, that the provider is so important, whether that be the physician or the nurse. And so, I think there's so many applications that actually free up more time so that they can spend more quality time with a patient. And I think those are the applications that also are equally as important than just the consumer side of it with mobile. I think they're both.
I appreciate what you're saying, but the day of the giant companies telling the rest of the world what they need is gone. Yeah. And I'm very sympathetic to your point. You can't take a culture that's from a developed country and provide it and say the Cleveland Clinic is going to tell the rest of the world what the health situation ought to be or how we ought to go at it. There's going to have to be some free-for-all, and there's going to have to be some learning. And the reason I'm coming from the consumer end, this is about what is the future of work going to be in the MENA region. And there are many examples where in the developed world, a phone is not necessary to learn how to get a digital skill, but in India, there's a woman, I wish I could remember her name, she's trained 100,000 women in the 11th grade in high school to get very fundamental digital skills so they could use a phone in rural areas and they don't even have to leave their home to actually earn a living. So this is where the developed world has to stand back and say, we want to provide this capacity to individuals, not just to corporations. There will be a connectivity, but I come back to ease of use, inexpense, very fast, and those three things are going to determine the winners and the losers of how this is going to go on. And the big corporations are going to have to learn there may be some loss of control here, and that's going to be a good thing. They'll learn and adapt, but in the process, we must create work for people to solve the three needs that Voltaire talked about. Otherwise, we're going to have a world in chaos.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about big corporations. I'm talking about expertise. I'm talking about the fact that it's very good for oncology models to be peer reviewed by professional oncologists before they're used by consumers. I think that the consumer world ended up with a few big networks. I think, and we ended up with a lot of false information. You end up with a lot of health information that's wrong. It doesn't actually help people, it makes it worse. So I do think professionals have a real role here, which is very different than big corporations, making it possible for professionals to train models and extend their knowledge because they're out of time, I think is going to bring it to more people.
But you're going to have to leave it to local governments, not to the big developed countries, to tell the undeveloped countries how to do it. And
oh, I agree.
You're going to have to let it go and train people to use it. So there will be 8 billion people that will be using these phones, and there will have to be experimentation.
But it's interesting, David, to your point, again, I think the provider is important, but I think there are things that can be done with AI that actually help prepare the consumer, because
Yes.
I agree, right now,
Yep.
In the US, if someone is going to the doctor and they have some sort of issue and they go to WebMD or Google or whatever, they self-diagnose. And as I've talked to, practitioners, they tell me that's one of the biggest wasted areas of time is consumers coming in and having self-diagnosed. So I think that if you can take your existing pathology and be able to prepare yourself with, so a physician, he's narrowed down some of the variables prior to seeing a patient. I think it actually.
One thing I even want to mention, so in Africa, we probably have like one of the most horrible doctor to patient ratios in the world, right? We just don't have the doctors, and more are fleeing every year, leaving the country. And I have a friend who started a HMO. It's a crazy idea, and his idea was basically, look, your HMO experience, your insurance company, health insurance experience, dives in Nigeria the moment you step into the hospital. You're quite happy to have health insurance until you really need to use it, because it means long wait lines, even when there are emergencies. It means they have to triple check and double check to prevent fraud, because there's just so many people at the hospitals, because there's no doctors and there's not enough hospitals for people. But the HMOs obviously have to sell something, and then it also means high costs for the HMOs because they can't do any proper modeling or anything. And so what he decided to do was to build a digital HMO. So when you're sick, you call a number, and you get a group of trained, he's not using AI per se, but he's just using a group of trained technicians who can kind of act as a first level response, right? And give you some information. You can also do this via chat. You can also do this via text message. And what he's basically done is he's cut down the number of visits by almost half. So most people are able to see, get what they want, talk to a doctor with basic diagnostic. It's something that's not too serious. They get a note that they can go to the pharmacy with, and then they have these pharmacy partnerships where you get your drugs and you're done. So I think increasingly, the way this will play out eventually is that we need less skilled professionals. But the other question is also that who makes up this set of skilled professionals, right? Like, are they all going to look the same? Are they all going to be people who are going to inculcate different perspectives? Are we building one prescription for the whole world? Are we going to look at other types of medicine, right? New ways of wellness, new approaches to wellness, right? That are not just like monographic, because there is a real risk, right? That what we imagine to be the best, quote unquote, models for, melanoma, it's really not, right? And we have to remain humble to that reality.
Well, there's something we didn't discuss before, but the conversation bringing us there is also education. How can we use technology to train? So you're talking about training, but also to educate and to get prepared for the impact of AI on the workforce. So I'd love to get your take from all of you. David, you want to start?
Back to things changing. I think that the notion of education and preparing is impossible if you've got exponential advances in machine learning every year, because you've got to move with it, right? So if I take places that have worked well, Credit Mutuel is an interesting bank in France, and we did a front page story with the CEO of the bank and the head of his union. And it was back to, was the union afraid of AI, or did it help them? And in fact, the AI had helped them improve their skills so they were less bored. Voltaire was right about work and boredom, but some work is boring, right? Answering the phone for basic questions over and over again in a rote way was boring. Because the AI took care of that, it actually helped the agents prepare. These machine learning systems do keep training, right? And that's why you need to have your own and not just one big general one. I totally agree with this localization. And so the agents felt smarter every month. So they felt their IQ was improving. They were getting to be more effective because they were training the machine and the machine was training them. But it was continuous improvement. Here in the UAE, we're working with both Dubai and Abu Dhabi on smart government approaches. Really awesome work is being done because they're learning the community, what the community needs. The community's learning how to work with the AI systems, and everyone's improving. But the education is not going to be in schools. It's going to be training people to be lifelong learners.
One of the key issues about AI is there are some false expectations that machines are going to run everything. I like to think about AI as a continuous partnership, as David is talking about, as a partnership between humans and machines. And I can't remember the name of the famous Russian chess player. Kasparov. He lost to a computer. Then he decided he would build a Centurion where he teamed up with a computer, and every time Kasparov teamed up with the computer, He beat the computer.
That's right.
Yes, that's true.
So we ought to think about AI as this partnership, and I think this will take some of the edge off the workforce saying, I'm going to be replaced by a machine. No, the machine is your assistant.
Yeah.
It will make you better in what you do. And this was the lesson from India. 100,000 11th grade women were able to enter the workforce with a cell phone.
Amazing.
Yeah, allow people to work smarter, you
Yeah.
know, it frees up more time, better
I think-
quality of life.
I think for me, I think the fundamental assumption that it breaks down is the structure of the education system. And so my experience before we started Andela was that we had tried to build a distance learning program for Nigerian universities, but the regulator, you know, we couldn't find a way to work with the regulator, so it failed, right? And that was how we started Andela, which was directly built to basically go around the regulator, right? So we normally, the way you would build a coding school is you would do a 4-year university program and graduate them and have them look for jobs. But then we went the other way around and said, hey, if we were paying them, the government could never say we weren't training them other than for our own use. And then if we found jobs outside of Nigeria, they wouldn't need education qualifications to even get those jobs. So we basically went around and rebuilt the model. And what a lot of people don't even know about how Andela really works is that internally we use a lot of data to understand how each person is learning and to build a learning path for them. So I think one huge area where there's this scene in The Matrix we always used to use kind of as an analogy for what we wanted to build. And the scene in The Matrix is the part where, you know, kind of a cartridge kind of goes into his head and he automatically has all the knowledge. And the way we imagine and the way we've built the way we've built systems at Andela in particular, and I hope more people would actually learn from kind of the work we've done in that area as we start to publish, is that it's actually possible for you to take a body of knowledge that traditional education has told us would take 4 years to master, and in 6 months, like we've done, give it to somebody who's not had anything more than a basic math, English, and science education. And they would be twice as good, which they are right now, as the kids coming out of Stanford, and cost half of it.
We're concerned at Watson about the job. So we funded 200 schools called P-Tech, Pathways to Technology, and it's a high school, it's a 14-year school or a 6-year high school versus 4. The last 2 are just to teach you how to have lifelong learning. And these graduates are amazing. Some go on to college, some come straight to work, but the fact that they learn how to learn is key because then they just stay with it. Exactly. And I think the education system is gonna have to evolve.
There's another key area that I think is going to have a huge impact on the Middle East and North Africa. And that is a digital transformation is coming to the energy industry.
Right.
Amazingly enough, here is one of the most potent industries in the area, and digitization has not come, and AI is going to accelerate it. So when you think about where the future workforce is going to be in the MENA region, unless there's some understanding and education and bringing along of the workforce for what could happen. For example, Morocco is putting in the world's largest solar farm, $3.9 billion for a solar farm. But how do I hook in this reusable energy into the grid? AI is going to play a major role. So if we're going to create the future jobs for things like energy, renewable, or just how do I get, there's a lot of AI that has gone into exploration for oil in the imagery, but how do I get from the oil well to the gas pump? How do I optimize the routing? How do I handle weather and supply and demand and natural disaster and all that planning? This is how, you know, with the price of oil fluctuating, if I could take 40% out of the cost of production from the wellhead to the gas pump, I could handle these fluctuations and not impact the economies enough. So these are the places that cloud AI is going to transform. And this is where, if I was in this region, I'd train my workforce because that's where the future jobs are going to be.
Message received. We have a few minutes for Q&A in the room, so if you have the mics on both sides. If you have any questions for our panel, now is the time.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your wonderful comments. I really picked up on AI as a continuous partnership. Would one of you or all of you comment on what the continuous partnership between AI and buildings will be? There's so much development of built environment in MENA and Africa right now. I'd love to hear your comments on this.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
we're doing a lot on smart buildings, connecting to IoT, right? So elevators, escalators, things that move the mechanics are all getting much better to do preventative maintenance. So companies like Kone have completely changed the economics. Back to energy, also just energy consumption and making it so that buildings are carbon neutral is totally doable by using machine learning to constantly look at the inputs and the outputs. So I think they're getting much, much smarter. I would say good architects are building this in from the beginning, so things that are being built now, I think are able to use it. Retrofitting will happen though. It's pretty easy to actually use IoT sensors. We just used it in the building we built for ourselves here in Abu Dhabi. And it's just made it a very simple, accessible place to work.
I think it's 30 or 40% of the businesses in the MENA region are up to 5 employees in companies. Building maintenance, we want to empower these people to handle these new technologies for the buildings. It's not just a question of building them. How do you maintain it, and how do you generate jobs in maintenance for small businesses, which are very important to the growing workforce here? And again, unless they have access and they have ease of use, and it cannot be expensive. The price for cloud computing now for machine learning is obscene, and it must come down. And there are new technologies coming along.
I think for me, I like to take these questions from a more fundamental layer. And what you realize when you look at sub-Saharan Africa is we have a huge housing crisis, right? No one needs to tell you that. We've got a huge housing deficit in Lagos alone of over 4 million homes. And again, there is no government, however well organized or resourced, that can actually fulfill that deficit. Now, the beauty of things like perhaps not even artificial intelligence, but just data, is that it clarifies demand and supply. We recently, I privately backed a company, which I'm very excited about, called fiber.com. And what Fiber does basically is make it easier for young professionals to find homes in Lagos, right? Which seems like a really simple thing, except if any of you have been to Lagos, you know you have to pay your rent 2 years in advance, right? And it's pretty ridiculous finding just any normal place. And 1 year after operating, they basically were like, look, the truth of the matter is, we've gone out and looked at 4,000 young professionals who, based on what they're paid, can actually afford housing. But the challenge is all the landlords are building 3 bedrooms because most landlords are family people. No one needs 3 bedrooms. Everybody needs 1 bed, as high as possible, piled on top of each other with a space for a toilet and a small kitchen, and that's it. And so they're actually now having to go into the supply game so they can actually provide affordable, functional, and available housing for young people because they are a majority of the region. And that's the kind of very simple thing that AI can provide. They can literally automatically tell you where demand is for housing. And they've done 2 experiments now with this, and literally they were filled up their housing in 2 days. So they said, this building is going up. We're going to use containers to build it. It's going to be up in 6 months. Please sign up. And literally in 2 days, they were fully booked. So even just at that fundamental level of sorting out demand and supply in more transparent ways and giving people, because these are guaranteed investments, quite frankly, right? No one has to do any math to figure out whether this real estate project is going to be worth it or not, right? It's literally, there's no empty housing here. It's literally targeted because the demand is already confirmed before supply went. So that's where I see AI actually playing. And then the AI around how these buildings will even be managed. So for example, they have to pay monthly, and there is no great credit infrastructure. Enforcement is tough. So what are they doing? They're basically, if you don't pay your rent, you're automatically locked out of the house, right? It's all controlled centrally. And then we can work out what a payment plan looks like. So this is essentially where AI, in Africa, at least I can speak for that, AI is taking us. It's very, very fundamental things, nothing crazy. IoT, great, like all that stuff, amazing, and we'll get there. But even on the basics of just demand and supply, so that we can more efficiently provide the basics for our people, that's where we're using AI to push forward.
And I'm going to come at it from a different perspective. So my dad's actually an architect and real estate developer. And so, I think that where AI will have such powerful effect is in the design and engineering process, being able to detect anomalies, help to ensure better construction, everything in supply chain management. So I think that it will help. I think it will help in the permitting process as well for governments to be able to review plans, to be able to permit the development. And so, I also think, in supply chain management for construction, again, I think it'll hopefully speed up development. It will ultimately lower cost and build better quality buildings.
All right, we have time for a few more questions. Not everybody at the same time. I have a question regarding data accessibility, which is essential
Yes.
for AI. And I'd like to get all of you actually on this subject. I know IBM is working on it also to make it accessible.
Well, listen, big companies shouldn't be deciding this. This is, I think smart governments are looking ahead on data. But Europe is probably the first along with GDPR. We've embraced that. I think we signed up for everything it stood for. Yeah, there's a little more cost to be accommodating, but I think the ability to actually maintain some markets to make sure all the data doesn't end up in a handful of big companies, making sure that there is the right to be forgotten, that there is a right to privacy. These things are all essential human rights. I think looking at that and how it comes to this part of the world, how it goes across all the continent of Africa, all the continents of Latin America, we're very focused on making sure people, governments, companies all understand their data rights, and that we maintain some structure on that there isn't a natural consolidation into a handful of platforms.
Don't you think blockchain helps with that? What's your take?
Well, we do think blockchain helps with that. So part of the reason we took all of our blockchain technology and donated it to Linux Foundation so that everyone would use it. Because we just said that the data economy required people to be able to trust it, back to medical records. Trust, I can share my medical record with you. You can give me a diagnosis, but that doesn't mean I publish it onto the internet. So often today, the only way people get value is to publish it to a social network or to the internet and make it free, but not all data should be that way. Some data should be private. So blockchain's a great way to protect that.
I agree. I think blockchain is going to be so powerful for AI that it's going to be transformative in ways that people can't even comprehend at this point.
There's another problem that gets beyond control and standards, and that is probably the biggest blockage to wide open use of AI, and that is the fact that as it begins to spread, there are uncorrelated data formats.
Yes.
And the most important thing about data is I could correlate data from this source to that source. We've been working with a number of very large companies that are undergoing large enterprises digital transformation. They could have, in a large company, 2,000 different departments. Each department has a different format. Just tracking their customers becomes a very difficult job. Now you take yourself as an individual user wanting to have a business. So one of the critical things that I believe is going to happen over the next 3 to 5 years is the technology will come along from AI that'll allow for correlated data. And once you get to correlated data, you've gone over a major threshold that will enable people to use it. So the place that governments will come in will be developing international standards which really are going to be helpful to not just the developed countries and the underdeveloped countries, but it'll make correlated data available to all. So it gets beyond just security, it gets to really jet propelling AI once we get to the point that we get correlated data.
But as it correlates, I think you need to get to the ground truth. You need to make sure there's trust in truth, right? So the reason I like blockchain is something simple like food safety. We assure that something was safe at the farm. You can then follow the whole supply chain all the way to fork and guarantee food safety. I want the same thing for facts. I want to know that it was a fact. I don't want to have any sense of fake news because it was either a fact or it wasn't a fact. A fact can be wrapped in blockchain, and the blockchain can be moved along.
Totally agree.
In all of this, in health, in accounting, in building integrity, you know, governments and the private sector work together to build systems of trust and integrity. We need to apply technology to that. Because otherwise, if you've correlated data but the first data was false, the whole thing is off.
I think for me, my thought is, right now there's a ton of data already existing, especially in the developed world. But there is an incredible opportunity to actually build out data for the developing world, right? A lot of developing world is still, even down to identity, doesn't exist. And it feels also like, and there's some efforts going on. Like in Nigeria, we have the bank verification number, which basically guarantees that every Nigerian with a bank account can be identified. And so when you're dealing with things like advanced fee fraud or internet fraudsters, you actually know where it's going, right? And you can actually set law enforcement on those people. And we've done a lot of that in our business. But I think there remains an opportunity to, again, help Africa leapfrog with its data by providing training and resources for them to be able to move to appropriate file formats, right? And so one of the questions I always ask, I spend a lot of time with the vice president of Nigeria, and one of those days I kind of asked him, I said, look, we're so bothered about getting everybody to sign up for this BVN thing, but like every day or every year, more kids than is in this database are like born, right? So why don't we just start with birth and death data? Like if we actually did that in like the next 50 years, it would actually roll over. And I'm not seeing that level of focus from the global community in saying, hey, look, every day, majority of the world over the next 50 years is going to be in Africa. So why don't we start helping these governments to actually to adopt appropriate file formats and data formats? Why aren't social networks more aggressive about getting people there? And maybe it shouldn't be social networks to do that. But my point is, ultimately, there remains a huge opportunity in places like in Africa to gather data that doesn't exist and make sure that data is in the right format and it meets all these requirements that we're talking about. But it seems like the rest of the world is just ignoring because there is no data. And so you have this consistent chicken and egg problem where Africa is consistently being excluded from the global economy because we don't know who they are. And no one's making an effort to actually develop the standards and the technology that would make it possible for us to actually find out.
But
right?
there is experience. As a world, we've worked in developing communication standards. You could pick up this phone and call any place in the world. So the words that you said, trust, I think is very, very important, David. You're on the right track. So there needs to be some level of trust. We're in the Wild West right now, and things are going on. But with trust, planes fly safely now because we've learned and we have international standards. Yep. I could pick up this phone and call any place in the world. So we need to move very, very fast as a planet with governments for some international standards, blockchain, and an approach where we all try and get trust into the system, and that'll get at some of the issues you're talking about.
And it is important that it be all governments, because Europe kind of took the lead. All businesses that work in Europe are going to adapt GDPR. That will make it the de facto world standard. It may or may not be perfect for the whole world. I think that making sure we engage all nations on these standards is essential in 2018, because they're going to get set now. Just
Amen.
Like they did in aviation, just like they did in communication.
Yeah.
All right, if there's no more question, I think...
Can I just say, and actually, going back to your example of aviation and communication, right? It's really funny. So communication is one of the things that propelled the GSM revolution in Africa, right?
Yeah.
It's why 900 million phones work, right?
Exactly.
Because anywhere you are in the world, you could always reach your family. And aviation, I mean, Africa is now kind of moving to one single sky because, for airlines, because the standards already exist, and so now all they have to do is put everything together. And even as much as one might not want to admit, like Visa and MasterCard have literally been the reason why people can go from one country to another and do business, right? And even though in Africa it's not particularly adapted to the local community, which is why local participation is important, it's helped. So I agree. I think, once we have some basis for these standards, then let's invest in the future of the world and make sure that they can actually adopt these data standards rather than going and having that conversation with the Social Security Administration or any of these other folks who will be very difficult to reform.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, aviation is a great example in talking about standards, rules, and regulations. I think we're getting there. As you all said, AI is super young right now. It's really starting to get into our lives. So we'll see more of it coming. So thank you so much to our panel. Thank you to the Milken Institute, and thank you all for attending this.
Thank you.